The oppressive midday heat weighed over the small Texas town like a heavy, unyielding blanket. The air was thick with a mixture of humidity and dust that coalesced into a suffocating haze, compelling residents to seek refuge beneath the limited shade offered by air-conditioned stores and homes along Main Street. This main thoroughfare, long and straight as if drawn by an invisible hand, lay silent and still under the relentless glare of the sun. It was on this scorching stage that a shiny black SUV emerged in the distance, its sleek form glinting as the sun's rays danced off its perfectly polished surface. The reflections created an almost otherworldly mirage, making the vehicle appear as if it were floating above the burning asphalt. Officer Darl Smith, meanwhile, sat in his patrol car with a languid air of disinterest. His day had been uneventful. No accidents, no traffic violations, only the relentless heat and the persistent silence that seemed to envelop the town. He idly sipped cold coffee from a plastic cup, his thoughts wandering as the monotony of the day stretched out before him. Then, without warning, the stillness was shattered by a sharp beep from his radar. His eyes snapped to the speedometer, where the number 72 blazed on the screen, far exceeding the local limit of 55 mph. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath. With a sudden shift of purpose, he set his coffee cup aside, placing it firmly in its holder, and switched on his emergency lights. He pressed the accelerator, determined to pursue the speeding vehicle. The SUV, however, showed no indication of deceleration. Still, Smith's confidence was unshaken. In his town, no one escaped the long arm of the law. His expression shifted to one of cool indifference, mixed with a hint of satisfaction, as if this was the very moment that made the dull hours of his morning worthwhile. Soon enough, the speeding vehicle pulled over at the side of the road. Smith braked hard, bringing his patrol car to an abrupt stop, and promptly stepped out. In a routine that he had performed countless times before, he adjusted his belt and hat as he approached the stopped SUV. The vehicle stood motionless, as though it were waiting for him. Almost ceremoniously, the driver's door swung open and out stepped a tall man dressed in a sharply tailored dark blue suit. His posture was impeccable, and his calm, measured demeanor set him apart from the ordinary. Yet, at first, Officer Smith seemed oblivious to the man's dignified bearing. "Let's see who's so important," Smith muttered to himself as he strode purposefully toward the car. He halted just a few feet from the driver's door, anticipating the usual resistance or the tired array of excuses he had come to expect from violators. "Your license and registration?" he demanded in a practiced tone of stern authority, his eyes fixed on the documents rather than on the man himself. This was nothing more than a mechanical, procedural routine. Request the necessary papers, issue a ticket if warranted, and then return to the drudgery of a quiet day. However, when the driver handed over his identification, Smith's hand trembled slightly as he read aloud, "General Lewis Johnson." He could hardly believe his eyes. The name was one he had heard repeatedly in the news, a name associated with distinguished military service, overseas operations, and heroism in the eyes of many. Yet, in that charged moment, Smith allowed no room for admiration or reconsideration. His heart pounded fiercely as he declared in a harsh tone, "You broke the law," deliberately ignoring the significance of the rank displayed on the ID. General Johnson, for his part, maintained an unruffled composure. Tilting his head just slightly, his voice emerged as calm and measured, as if he were accustomed to diffusing tense situations without resorting to anger. This very calm, however, served only to intensify Smith's simmering fury. A torrent of thoughts flooded his mind. Why was this man so calm? Did he really think himself above the law? Officer Smith, hardened by a life of personal hardships, had long distrusted those who were wealthy, influential, and successful. In his view, such people always seemed to believe that their status granted them immunity from consequences. Smith's experiences had taught him that those who had never known real struggle were incapable of understanding the true nature of hardship. "Put your hands on the car," Smith ordered sharply, his voice rising with authority. For a brief moment, Johnson hesitated, as if weighing the situation. Then, recognizing that resistance would only worsen the circumstances, he complied. Inside, however, Smith's anger was boiling over. He felt that this confrontation was his long-awaited chance to vent the pent-up tension that had been simmering within him. A dark, almost primitive urge to punish what he perceived as arrogance and entitlement. In his mind, the general was not merely a driver. He was a symbol of someone who dared to flaunt his privilege. Without further ado, Smith advanced and abruptly seized Johnson's wrist, twisting it behind the man's back in a sudden, uncalculated motion. The general's gaze, cold and unyielding, met his with an intensity that conveyed neither resistance nor fear. "What's this about?" Johnson asked evenly, turning his head to look directly at the officer. In that moment, the general's unwavering calm stirred in Smith a cocktail of emotions, a mixture of irritation, fear, and an anxiety he was loath to acknowledge even to himself. "We're going to check if you've got anything illegal in the car," Smith declared, his tone brimming with authority even though he had no concrete grounds for suspicion. In his mind, the arrest was already a foregone conclusion. Another black man relying on the system for protection. Another case to be processed without mercy. Yet this time, Officer Smith resolved that no amount of influence or connection would save General Johnson. The general did not resist, his compliance silent and almost dignified. But as Smith reached for his handcuffs, preparing to secure Johnson's wrists, fate intervened. At that precise moment, a police car from another department cruised past, unnoticed by the officer. Simultaneously, a second officer pulled over nearby and called out, "Darryl, what's going on?" It was Lieutenant Rodriguez, a man Smith respected despite their occasional differences. "Just detaining a violator," Smith grunted dismissively, paying little heed to his colleague's interjection. Undeterred, Smith continued to pull out the handcuffs. "Who's the violator?" Rodriguez asked, stepping closer as his eyes widened in disbelief when he saw the face of General Johnson. "Darryl, that's General Johnson," Rodriguez stated firmly, waving his hand to signal for Smith to halt immediately. In that split second, uncertainty crept into Smith's voice. He sensed that something was awry, an instinctive warning that he should stop, but his pride and stubbornness refused to let him heed that inner voice. He quickly glanced between Rodriguez and the unflappable general, who remained as calm as ever. "It doesn't matter who he is," Smith snapped, desperately clinging to the notion that no one was above the law. Rodriguez hesitated, clearly troubled by the unfolding events. He had known Smith long enough to understand his straightforward, sometimes harsh approach to authority. "Maybe this isn't what you think, Darryl," Rodriguez said slowly, his voice softening in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Let's just talk, let him go, and we'll figure it out." But Smith's response was immediate and laced with aggression. "You kidding me? This guy clearly thinks he can do whatever he wants," he retorted, his tone rising with contempt. "Look at him, standing there as if he doesn't care. Maybe he's even got drugs or weapons in the car." At that moment, General Johnson turned to face Smith directly. His expression was unreadable, calm and composed, yet with a subtle spark in his eyes that spoke of disappointment rather than anger. Over the years, Johnson had witnessed far too many instances where the very system designed to protect had instead betrayed its people. "Officer," he said in a steady, even tone, "I did nothing wrong except speeding, and I accept full responsibility for that. But if you think you can intimidate me simply because I'm black, then you are gravely mistaken." Those words struck Smith like a blow. His eyes narrowed and anger flared as he found it intolerable to be spoken back to, especially by someone he had already judged as arrogant and privileged. To him, General Johnson embodied every trait he despised, a man who dared to hide behind his success and use it as a shield from accountability. Taking a step even closer, nearly invading the general's personal space, Smith hissed, "You're not getting away with this. You're going to pay for your attitude." Before Smith could escalate the situation further, Rodriguez intervened by grabbing his arm. "Darryl, stop," he commanded firmly. "You're making a huge mistake." For a moment, Smith froze. Then he jerked his arm away and retorted, "What are you doing, Rodriguez? I'm in control here. This guy broke the law and I'm going to deal with it." Rodriguez sighed heavily, recognizing that words alone would not rein in his partner's escalating anger. He pulled his phone from his pocket and began recording the unfolding events. Noticing the movement out of the corner of his eye, Smith felt a fresh surge of anger. "What are you doing?" he bellowed, his voice edged with desperation. "I'm recording," Rodriguez replied coldly. "We need evidence, and if you keep this up, you're going to bury yourself." Suddenly, the tense air was broken by the sound of another vehicle approaching. A car pulled up from the opposite side of the road, and from it emerged a man in a suit. Initially, Smith did not recognize the newcomer, but as he drew closer, it became clear that he was a member of the press. A journalist from the local newspaper or perhaps a television station, ready to capture every moment on camera. As the reality of the situation sank in, Smith could feel everything spiraling out of control. His inner voice begged him to stop, yet his stubborn pride and rising fury pushed him forward. In a desperate bid to regain dominance, he abruptly grabbed General Johnson by the shoulder and attempted to force him onto the hood of his patrol car in order to cuff him. But with one swift, graceful move, Johnson spun around, freeing his arm and locking eyes with Smith. "This will be your last mistake," the general said calmly. "Not because I am a general, but because I am a citizen of this country. I will not allow someone like you to trample on my rights." Smith froze, shocked by the unwavering resolve in Johnson's voice. For a long moment, he was at a loss for how to proceed. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs and whispers swelling as the unfolding drama captured everyone's attention. The journalist continued filming while Rodriguez's phone remained fixed on Smith. In that moment, it became painfully clear to Smith that he had already lost control of the situation. General Johnson stepped back and sighed, his tone serene, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of finality. "I won't do anything against the law," he stated. "I'm not here to cause trouble. But you, officer, will have to answer for your actions." A cold sweat began to trickle down Smith's back as the magnitude of his overreach became undeniable. He felt as though he had crossed an irrevocable line. What had begun as a routine stop had exploded into a confrontation that now threatened to destroy him. His mind raced with the realization that this was supposed to be a simple matter: stop a violator, write a ticket, and return to patrolling. Instead, every element around him was screaming that he had gone too far. Before him stood a man whose calm demeanor had transformed him from a mere driver into a symbol of everything Smith had long resented. "Stop!" Rodriguez's voice rang out once more, firm and insistent. "You're losing control! Stop before it's too late!" But Smith, consumed by a mixture of righteous anger, frustration, and fear for his career, could no longer hear reason. His eyes locked with Johnson's, and in that steady gaze he saw not only confidence but a profound certainty. A certainty that every step he had taken that day was a violation of the law rather than its enforcement. In that charged moment, something inside Smith began to crumble. Johnson's steady tone, his calm and deliberate manner, disarmed him in a way that physical force never could. "I'm not done yet," Smith managed to say, clenching his jaw as his voice wavered with internal uncertainty. He was still clinging to the illusion of control, even as it slipped inexorably away. Meanwhile, the bystanders' murmurs grew louder, their eyes fixed on the dramatic scene. A few had already produced their cell phones to record every detail. The realization dawned on Smith that his actions were now public, documented for all to see, and that one single mistake might well spell the end of his career. Rodriguez's camera captured every agonizing moment. With each passing second, the full, terrible reality became clearer to Smith. One error, one moment of unchecked aggression could end everything he had built over years of service. General Johnson broke the tense silence with a final, measured remark. "I'm giving you one last chance," he said quietly. "We both know that this has gone too far. I do not wish for you to lose your job, but if you continue down this path, the consequences will be severe." Those words struck Smith like a hammer blow. An ordinary violator would never have spoken in such a manner, yet Johnson was no ordinary man. Everything within Smith tightened, and he struggled to hold back the urge to attack. Still, the calm in the general's voice, the unwavering certainty in his eyes, made Smith pause. He wondered, how far was he willing to go? What would be the ultimate consequence of his actions? "Are you threatening me?" Smith finally shot back, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "No," Johnson replied with a faint, measured smile. "I'm merely reminding you that we all have responsibilities, even those who wear the uniform." Smith found himself unable to counter the simple truth of those words. His own justifications, his deeply ingrained biases, now felt hollow against the stark clarity of Johnson's calm confidence. For the first time that day, the officer felt an unfamiliar sense of powerlessness, a sensation that was utterly unacceptable to someone who prided himself on being in control. Desperation clawed at him as he contemplated his limited options. He could have released the general and allowed the matter to end here. thereby preserving what little dignity he had left. But the thought of admitting defeat, of acknowledging that he had lost control, was unbearable. He worried not only about what his peers would think, but also about the judgment of his superiors. Anger boiled in his chest, drowning out the last remnants of reason. And yet, deep inside, Smith understood one immutable truth. If he did not stop immediately, the consequences would be catastrophic. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Smith finally loosened his grip on General Johnson's arm. "All right," he growled, struggling to suppress his anger. "You can go." The general, unperturbed, regarded him steadily for a long moment before replying in a quiet tone. "You're lucky I'm not filing a complaint. But remember, it isn't because you were right. It's because someone had to show you how to act properly." Smith offered no further response. He turned slowly and walked back to his patrol car, burdened by the heavy, disapproving stares of the gathering crowd. Every step felt laden with the knowledge that he had lost, and every whispered remark from onlookers stung like a lash. Inside his car, Smith gripped the steering wheel tightly as his hands trembled. This was no longer a simple incident. It was a monumental mistake that would catch up with him faster than he had ever anticipated. Meanwhile, General Johnson calmly climbed into his SUV, started the engine with deliberate ease, and drove away, leaving behind a tumult of emotions, disappointment, and an inevitable reckoning. Rodriguez, having finished recording, put his phone away and approached Smith quietly. "You really went too far, Darryl," he said softly. "I recorded everything. If you hadn't stopped when you did, this could have been the end of your career." Smith remained silent, his gaze fixed straight ahead as he absorbed the crushing weight of his actions. In that moment he realized with dismay that the video of his disgraceful conduct had already spread across the internet. He had just walked into the station when the full force of his superior's anger was unleashed, and the worst was yet to come. Later that evening at home, Smith switched on the television and was confronted by a live discussion about the incident. General Johnson's calm, resolute face filled the screen as he gave an interview. "This incident isn't merely a mistake by one officer," Johnson explained, looking directly into the camera. "It is a manifestation of how deeply racism is embedded in our system. If we do not start fighting it now, these incidents will continue to occur time and again." Smith could hardly believe his eyes. He had known deep down that this day would come, yet he was not ready for the reality that now confronted him. General Johnson had become more than just a participant in the encounter. He had become a symbol of the fight against police brutality, while Smith had inadvertently become the face of a system now under fire. The phone on the table buzzed relentlessly, and a new video notification flashed on the screen. A video in which Smith was the undeniable main character. Without even watching it, he understood that his life had changed forever. Social media was aflame with outrage and condemnation, the comments filled with anger and despair. His mind raced with anxious thoughts. What would happen next? What should he do now? Setting the phone aside, Smith took a deep, shuddering breath and rose from the couch. He trudged into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, his hand trembling as he reflected on the years of service he had once held dear. Now, everything was overturned by one catastrophic mistake. Before long, the ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts again. When he saw Lieutenant Rodriguez on the caller ID, he answered with a resigned, "Yes?" Rodriguez's voice, as serious and cold as ever, came through. "Darryl, we need to talk. Have you seen what's happening online?" Smith replied shortly, "I have." Rodriguez continued gravely. "We've got bad news, Darryl. The department is officially launching an investigation. This isn't just a minor complaint. They want to review every case you've handled over the past few years." Each word from Rodriguez struck Smith like a hammer blow, and his heart seemed to slow under the weight of their implications. "They're going to dig deep, Darryl, and if they uncover anything, nothing will ever be the same again," Rodriguez added in a low, foreboding tone. Smith could offer no response. Instead, he simply hung up the phone and slumped back onto the couch, staring blankly into space as the terrible reality of his situation settled in. The following morning, Smith awoke to the sound of a firm knock on his door. With a heavy heart and a body that felt as if weighed down by every regret, he opened the door to find two men in formal suits. One of them introduced himself as an FBI agent, his tone dry and matter-of-fact. Smith nodded silently, understanding without words what was coming next. "Officer Smith," the agent said, "we'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident with General Johnson." Smith stepped aside to let the men in, and soon they were seated in his modest living room. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every second that passed seemed to intensify the silence between them. "Let's begin with the basics," said the second agent. "Why did you stop General Johnson?" Smith's mind raced as he tried to piece together the events of that long-ago afternoon, a day that now seemed distant and surreal. "He was speeding," he managed to say, his voice barely audible and laden with regret. But the questioning did not end there. "What we need to understand is why your behavior escalated far beyond standard procedure. Why did you resort to such aggression when the situation did not warrant it?" Smith felt his hands clench into fists as the full weight of his guilt and shame pressed upon him. Every action he had taken that day was now under a harsh, unyielding spotlight, a spotlight that revealed the anger and prejudice that had driven him. I was following my instincts," he stammered, his voice weak and trembling. "I thought he was hiding something, and I believed that justified the use of force." The agent's voice turned cold as he pressed further. "So you assume that your suspicions were enough to warrant that level of aggression?" For a long, agonizing moment, Smith could offer no reply. The truth of that day, the truth of his actions born of anger and prejudice, was now laid bare for these men to judge. Finally, the agent spoke one last time. "We will continue the investigation, Officer Smith. Expect further instructions, and we strongly advise that you secure legal representation." With that final curt statement, the agents rose and escorted him to the door. As soon as the door closed behind them, Smith sank to the floor, head in his hands, overwhelmed by the realization that his life would never be the same again. In the days that followed, the fallout from the incident grew increasingly severe. Every time the news replayed the footage of his confrontation with General Johnson, each clip zooming in on his anguished face, the public's judgment grew heavier. Neighbors who once greeted him now averted their eyes, and the isolation he felt deepened with every whispered comment and sidelong glance. Then, in an unexpected twist of fate, while sitting alone at his computer one afternoon, Smith stumbled upon a recording of a live broadcast. On the screen, General Johnson was delivering a speech. His words were calm, measured, and imbued with a quiet determination. "This incident," Johnson declared, "is not merely an affront to my personal dignity. It is a demonstration of how our system suppresses and humiliates people based solely on their appearance. I refuse to let this be about me alone. I want it to spark a conversation about police reform and lead to meaningful change." Smith stared at the screen, his heart heavy with regret and disbelief. He had known deep inside that this day might come, yet nothing could have prepared him for the reality before him. General Johnson had transcended the role of a mere violator. He had become a symbol of the struggle against injustice, while Smith had, in one fateful moment, become the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the system he had once sworn to protect. Even as his phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications and new video uploads, Smith realized that his life was irrevocably changed. He set the phone aside and took a deep, shuddering breath. Never before had he felt so utterly helpless. Slowly he rose from the couch and trudged into the kitchen to pour himself a glass of water. His hand trembled visibly, a stark reminder of the years he had dedicated to upholding the law, now rendered meaningless by one catastrophic encounter. General Johnson, the man who had once been nothing more than a speeding driver, had become a hero in the eyes of many, while Smith had become the face of unchecked aggression. Later that day, as the ringing of his phone interrupted his thoughts once more, Smith saw the caller ID flash, Lieutenant Rodriguez. With a resigned "yes," he answered. Rodriguez's voice was serious and cold as he said, "Daryl, we need to talk. Have you seen what's happening online?" Smith replied shortly, "I have." Rodriguez continued, "Daryl, this is serious. The department is launching a full investigation into your conduct. They are reviewing every case you've handled over the past several years." Each word hit Smith like a heavy blow, and his heart sank under the crushing weight of the consequences. "They're going to dig deep, Daryl, and if they find anything, nothing will ever be the same," Rodriguez added in a low, ominous tone. Smith could offer no response, and after a long silence, he simply hung up the phone and sat back down on the couch, staring blankly as he realized that his life was now irrevocably altered. That morning, when Smith awoke to the sound of a persistent knock on his door, he felt as if his very body were weighed down by regret. Opening the door, he was met by two men in formal suits. One introduced himself as an FBI agent, his tone dry and matter-of-fact. Smith nodded silently, understanding without words what was about to occur. "Officer Smith, we'd like to ask you a few questions about the incident with General Johnson," the agent said, his voice devoid of any compassion. Smith stepped aside to let them in, and soon they were seated in his modest living room. The air was heavy with tension, and every second that passed deepened the silence between them. "Let's begin with the basics," said the second agent. "Why did you stop General Johnson?" Smith's mind raced as he attempted to piece together the fragmented memories of that fateful afternoon, a day that now seemed like a distant, surreal nightmare. "He was speeding," he finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. But the questioning did not end there. "What we need to understand is why your behavior escalated so far beyond standard procedure. Why did you resort to aggression when the situation clearly did not call for it?" In that moment, as Smith sat there with his head bowed and his hands trembling, the full weight of his guilt and shame pressed down on him like a physical force. Every action he had taken was now laid bare for judgment, a stark reminder that his conduct was driven by a volatile mix of anger and prejudice. I was following my instincts," he stammered, his voice shaking with regret. "I thought he was hiding something, and I believed that justified my actions." The agents exchanged a brief look before one of them spoke once more. "We will continue the investigation, Officer Smith. Expect further instructions, and you would be wise to secure legal representation immediately." With those final words, the agents rose and escorted him to the door. As soon as the door closed behind them, Smith sank to the floor, head in his hands, overwhelmed by the crushing reality that his life had been irrevocably altered. Thus ended that tumultuous day. A day that began with the relentless heat over a small Texas town and ended with the irrevocable collapse of one officer's career and dignity. Smith was left to face the consequences of his actions, knowing that every step he had taken that day would be scrutinized and that his mistake would haunt him for the rest of his life.